Hi, and welcome back to Assessing Achievement with the ELL in mind. In the last lesson, we discussed a bit about using rubrics and monitoring techniques to assess learning and language objectives for a task or course. In this lesson, we will discuss the use of implicit and explicit feedback in error correction for language development of your ELLs in the content classroom. Language error correction happens mainly during students' output of language, or when they are producing language in spoken or written form. First and foremost, note errors as you interact with the student and really hone in on those consistent errors that are common for a specific student. In speaking, error correction should happen only if it's necessary for content understanding and mastery. Don't focus too heavily on correcting grammatical errors for a student through informal interaction unless it is impeding theirs or someone else's understanding of content. Use error correction as a way to create specific opportunities for language practice. Those errors noticed through interactions and through conversations with the student then become points of teaching and learning for him and her. And of course, create opportunities for student self-correction and growth. In recasting language or in written feedback, provide students opportunities to self-correct. Remember that continual correction for non-content understanding can actually lower student self-confidence in the content area. And if the corrections themselves halt the flow of content communication, it can be very frustrating for the learner. Make sure error correction is specific, necessary, and thoughtful. When talking about feedback, we will use the following definition. Feedback is used to teach skills to help students improve their language and make them aware of what is expected of them. Feedback should prepare them to produce with minimal error and maximum clarity. We'll talk a little bit more about written feedback in our next lesson when we actually go through an example assessment. It is important to note the difference between implicit and explicit feedback. Implicit feedback is more informal. It is usually done through interaction and recast. A recast in language development is when a student produces language incorrectly. The receiver repeats the correct version of that sentence or idea. Often, the student will repeat the sentence correctly by mimicking what you say. For example, the student says, "Her is going to the store." You might repeat, "She is going to the store." And the student would hopefully repeat as well, "She is going to the store." And the conversation would continue. There is very little or no explanation as to why her original sentence was incorrect. Implicit feedback is used primarily for vocabulary development and for language structures used for learning, as it is formative in nature. Explicit feedback, or metalinguistic feedback, is a bit more detailed in that once the error is identified, the teacher can choose to either provide an explanation for the error in an alternative response or leave the student to self-correct that error, which is suggested, especially in writing. Explicit and metalinguistic feedback is used to revise language and should really be coupled with a student-teacher conference or more detailed explanation of the error. Explicit feedback should focus on errors specific to the task and to what you explicitly taught the student in class. Explicit feedback is widely considered more relevant to the development of a student's second language and should be used very thoughtfully in class. Here are some questions to consider when giving feedback, either implicit or explicit. The first question is the feedback consistent with the goals of the task, shared vision, and learning and language objectives? If so, you are probably on the right track giving feedback. If not, then it might not be necessary to offer the feedback at that time. The second question is the feedback clear? In other words, does the student understand your feedback, both spoken and written? Number 3, have I only marked language errors for the things we have gone over in class? Again, it's not necessary to correct every error, especially if the student hasn't learned that aspect of language yet. And finally, did I provide feedback for the criteria given to the students? Am I correcting errors for the criteria I told my students to focus on? And if that's true, again, you're probably on the right track. In error correction and providing feedback for students, focus on making the feedback relevant and necessary for the students' growth as language learners and their mastery of your content area.